We're live.
Okay. Hey, we're going to wait for just 2 minutes while people arrive. You see the numbers? And mute my audio. We'll allow for a couple more minutes before I launch. Actually, I have 1:14, so I'm going to wait another couple minutes. Your audio is fine. It's just that I'm waiting for more people to show up. Give it to 1:18, 17. How about 1:17? All right, so there's 1:17, and this is the close of these 2 days. I want to thank especially Allison for commandeering this whole effort and assisted ably by Alegria and Kristen. And thank you, Bones, for doing all the technical stuff. Thank you all the panelists. It was really kind of thrilling today to hear everybody, very moving and informative. And so thank you all the folks who moderated those panels and all the people who brought a wealth of experience and wisdom. And judging by the comments on the side, I think people found it, helpful. So the Global Homeboy Network doesn't argue and fight with an existing model. It wants to create a new one. It wants to be and move, if you will, from dirty coal to clean natural gas. And all of you are what Pope Francis calls social poets, who stand at the margins with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop. You are the ones called to imagine the way forward, not so much as community leaders and director of works, but as servants and stewards of kinship and connection. You don't hurry through the world, but you walk slowly and you bow often, which is kind of a Zen notion. People have accused me of being half Jesuit and half Buddhist, and they're not all that off. Here are 3 little moments of Zen to kind of get us in the mood. there was a homie who came into my office and he plunked himself down. He said, "Hey, G, you want me to do nothing?" And I thought, "You want me to do nothing?" And I thanked him and I said that I had plenty of people already doing that. Second moment of Zen, a little kid named Betito who lived in Aliso Village housing projects. He wasn't from a gang, but he was part of this group of munchkins that would come our office on First Street many years ago. And he stood in front of my desk and he said, "Hey, G, are you going anywhere?" I said, "No." "Can I go with you?" And the third moment of Zen, before the pandemic, when we had actual customers at Homegirl Cafe, I remember there were these three women who came from the West Side to have lunch. And their waitress was Taryn, and Taryn's very tall, and she's towering over this table, and she's taking their order. And the woman says, "What's the soup of the day?" And Taryn says, "Chicken lime." And the woman says, "Is it hot?" And Taryn says, "It's soup." So the Dalai Lama, continuing this thread of Zen and Buddhism, he always speaks about Buddha nature, that we all have it, that there are no exceptions. I call it unshakable goodness, no exceptions. So there are 8 of us, brothers and sisters, and all 8 of us went to St. Brendan's Grammar School, and which was run by the BVM nuns. And in the 60s, they forced us to memorize this little ditty: "Good, better, best, never let it rest, until the good is better, and the better best." They meant well. I suspect that the real starting point wasn't good, but bad. That we somehow were all thrown out of the Garden of Eden, and that we're now just trying to claw our way back in. A homie just last week texted me, and I hadn't heard from him for a while, and he texted me just this: "Pops, what can I do to be a better man?" And I'll admit that it felt more heartbreaking to me than an expression of aspiration. I texted him back, "Son, you could not be one bit better." Also recently, I don't know how this homie found it, but he found some YouTube talk by a bishop who was talking about sin and about how the problem was we weren't contrite enough. And he just locked onto this word contrite. And he felt that the word really spoke to him. And in fact, it sent him spiraling into this pit where he felt he was, in truth, a worthless piece of shit. And I texted him back, "God doesn't see sin. God sees sun." And I think he found some relief in knowing that truth. All of us, I think, like the prophet Micah because he's so clear, and he has that one verse where he tells us what to do: to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. So I read a translation once that was really quite different. And instead of love mercy, it said love goodness, which I liked. It suggested not how to love, but presented love more as a Geiger counter. So I know I'm not alone in probably watching more Netflix and TV than you normally would before the pandemic. Anyway, I was watching this ketchup commercial, and in it, this couple with two little kids walk into a diner. It is the creepiest, scariest, filthiest diner you've ever wanted to see. And there was only one customer in it. Sitting in a booth was a clown, really creepy, like from a horror movie. The only other person in the diner is the cook, big, huge, scary looking guy with a black eye patch. And the couple, you can tell they're trying to decide, should we eat here? When all of a sudden, the woman sees it over on the counter, Heinz ketchup. And there's this glorious string quartet music playing, and the husband and wife look at each other and they nod. And so the last scene is they're in a booth and they're eating hamburgers and they're putting ketchup on their burgers. And the moral of the story runs across the screen and it says, find the goodness. So beyond creepy clowns and menacing chefs, there is goodness. I remember once I was in a room full of people and there was a donor talking to other donors. And he gets up and he says, Father Greg doesn't see gang member. He sees potential. And I remember thinking, yeah, not quite. I only want to see goodness. It's not about discovering your good qualities and making them better, nor is it about potential. We find our true selves in loving, in the verb of it. Otherwise, we get stuck in the noun of it. What seeks perfection is not our self, but our love. Endlessly, though, we keep trying to rid ourselves of ourselves. We just won't let go of this grudge we carry on about with ourselves. Again, pre-pandemic, I was baptizing the fifth kid of a homie I knew named Horacio. And I baptized all 5 kids. I did their wedding. And it's one of those gracious moments where you're just so overwhelmed with another person's goodness. And I look at this kid and I watch him corral all the relatives, the suegra and the siblings and the kids, and it's like cats, and he's doing it so masterfully. And of course, it's his 5th time, so he's kind of an expert. You look at him and he's a very scrawny, skinny kid with big ass ears, and you would look at him and you would think he could probably hardly ever manage himself as a gang member. Trust me, he managed. I can remember many years ago, he and his kid brother, I saw them when they were little mocositos and they were walking in the projects in the middle of the day. And I said, hey, did you ditch school? He was insulted. We didn't ditch. We just didn't go. My apologies. But I'm looking at him now and I'm just so filled. He is a mansion with many rooms. He is an incandescent soul. And it reminded me of the poet Mary Oliver, who writes, I find my soul clapping its hands for yours more than my own. So after the baptism and people are taking pictures, I call them over and I said, hey, you know what I was thinking about right now during the baptism? And he said, that I got to stop having kids. I said, no, because I'm thinking of getting a vasectomy. I said, no, dog. I was just thinking how thoroughly good you are. And what a beautiful job you've done with your life. And both of our eyes get flooded when we allowed our souls to quicken at hearing what it didn't know it already knew. Horacio was the whole accomplishment. My soul was clapping its hands. Love as a Geiger counter. It doesn't want Horacio to meet his potential or even get a vasectomy. It just wants to zero in on his goodness. And then our grief and our trauma are mere visitors, but not who we are. The goodness puts the thumb on the scale. Find the goodness. Our deep center, our Buddha nature is indeed saturated with divinity. Love will always find it there. The discovery that we are the magnanimity of God, the very generosity of God. And then it is no longer about doing good, but loving goodness. So a number of years ago, I was invited to go to Pelican Bay Prison, and it's up right at the border of Oregon and California. And I think everybody would say that it is widely considered as the prison in the state of California for the worst of the worst. And I had been there before. This was my second visit, and invited by a great man, a chaplain named Sam. And before we were going to say mass in this gym, before that, he walked me through the SHU, the security housing unit, and a few other places. And he would kind of go ahead of me before each cell. And he'd announce, it's Father Greg from Homeboy Industries. And it was kind of an old home week because there were a lot of Angelinos and a lot of guys I knew from juvenile hall, or they remembered me, and from probation camp or detention facilities. I got to one door and I didn't know this guy, and he says, "You're Father Greg?" I said, "Yeah." He goes, "Huh, you look skinnier on TV." Thank you. So we go to the gym, the A yard, and they get 200 guys in the gym for mass. So I do mass, and after mass, the chaplain has been able to get permission for a camera, and he's taking pictures, which is normally not a permission granted. But so the picture with 1 or 2 or 8 guys, inmates, and in every picture is this photo bomber. His name is Louis, and Louis his face is covered in tattoos, and I find out later that he has all day, which means he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He will die in prison. But he's charming and goofy and funny, and he's in every picture. So when we leave, Sam and I were walking out on the yard, and I'm telling him about Louis the photo bomber, and he tells me this story. That several months before, a concert pianist named Eric Genuis, who's played in Carnegie Hall, came and did a concert. And he plays the piano, and I think they had 2 strings, a violin and a bass. And you know, he was going to play for 45 minutes and then have 15 minutes of a question and answer. And Sam was kind of disappointed. He had secured permission of 200 inmates, but only 60 showed up. And Eric starts to play. And Sam is standing by the wall, and he looks at the faces of the inmates, and they just are sobbing. They're weeping. every single inmate sitting there without controlling it, without trying to stop its flow. They're sobbing. And then he looks at the guards who line the walls and notices that they're flicking a tear with great discretion. And Sam can't believe how unanimous this response was. Everybody's just sobbing. It sort of unlocked some door. And then he stopped playing. It's 45 minutes. And then he said, any questions, or anybody want to say anything? And nobody has anything to say until Louis, the photobomber, stands, and he's just sobbing, and he can barely speak. And he's trying to find something to say when suddenly the only word he can say through his tears is why. And Eric starts to cry himself. And he says, because you are deserving. You are worthy of beauty and music. And because there is no difference between you and me. What saves us in the present moment is being anchored in love, tethered to a sustaining God who reminds us with every breath our own unshakable goodness. Why? That's why. Every homie is a quaint city in a land you've never seen before. We don't save homies. We see them. A homie said to me once, see me for the first time and I won't forget how I look. I never say basic goodness. I never say essential goodness, because it always feels like we're hedging our bets. I always say unshakable goodness. That is our royal nature. We all help each other find our way home, to have full and free access to our own undeniable goodness. At Homeboy Industries, we believe that changing behavior is not transformation. Our unshakable goodness and dignity is never in question, but only our access to it. 21 years ago, an immigrant from Ghana was shot to death in the Bronx by 4 police officers from the New York Police Department. His name was Amadou Diallo, and they shot 41 times and hit him 19. And a New York Times reporter kind of reviewing it 20 years later in the documentary, she said, we realized that the police weren't trained for innocence. It's about seeing differently. We then undertake the search for innocence in the other. We cease to find the guilty party. We no longer divide into 2 camps, heroes and villains. We end up only seeing heroes. We look for the immutable goodness that's always there in the other. No exceptions. Love as the Geiger counter, watching for any sign of light and strength. Trained for innocence. We've come to see Lefty over there, and we presume he's up to all good. That's how we train. Only the false self notices how far you have to go. It will always, always be less exhausting to love than to find fault. When we see fault, we immediately believe that something has to be done about it. But love knows that nothing is ever needed but more love. As the great Stevie Avalos says nearly daily, love, love, and more love. Only love sees. So earlier I was telling you about a kid named Betito. He was 13 years old. Are you going anywhere? Nope. Can I go with you? And he was a precocious kid, 13 years old, and he came in once and he said, "Hey, G, kick me down with 20 bones, yeah?" I said, "What do you need $20 for?" "Taking my lady to the movies." "My God, your lady, how old are you?" 13. "My 13, how old is your lady?" 16. I said, 16? He goes, "Yeah, but she's short." "Oh, here's 20 bucks. His English was not great. It was not his first language, and he struggled with it, but he was like a sponge, and he would just sort of soak up expressions. Like once he came into my office, he said, "Hey, G, you know what you are?" I said, "No, what?" "You're the real deal," at $1.99. I'm sure it was some slogan from Boyle Local. And then go figure, it became our nickname for each other. I'd call him, "Hey, real deal, get over here, help me with this." He called me real deal, I called him real deal. And then one Sunday evening, he was out playing late. There wasn't school the next day, some holiday. And there were a lot of people out. And there were a couple gang members standing by a dumpster smoking a cigarette when a van came in with two guys in it, and they rolled down their windows and they pointed guns, and the shooting began. And every man, woman, and child knows in the projects that when the shooting begins, you hunker, you move, you hide behind the car, you move. And Betito knew that, except for some reason he froze, and because he did, a very large bullet entered his side and traveled through his body. It's called a through and through. The ER doctor told me many weeks later that it was such a high caliber bullet that the sheer reverberation of this bullet traversing his body rendered him paralyzed from the waist down, even though the bullet never touched his spine. So I went to the hospital and sat in the waiting room with the grandmother who was raising him. And we stayed all night long and kept vigil. We watched the sun come up, and the next morning I'm staring at him through the window of his intensive care unit as I watched doctors and nurses pound on his chest and beg and plead with his body to cooperate. And it just couldn't do it. And he died. And he was 13 years old. And he was the real deal. And I think before he left us, he knew his Buddha nature, his unshakable goodness. And everybody knows that no bullet can pierce that. But a couple weeks after Beto died, I came to know who the two in the car were, in the van, who shot. And I knew them too. And I knew what they carried, and I knew what torture they endured. And I knew them. I saw them. And they were no less the real deal. But they didn't have access to it. It takes time for folks to see this. Folks who don't as yet own themselves, who haven't yet been properly introduced to themselves, who have been hijacked by their own trauma. Things have happened to them that have darkened their lives forever. Until you appear a light that people can see by, your heart knows the way. Run in that direction. All of you know the forgotten dialect of the heart. Every one of you, social poets, you know how to see and help the demonized to find the wide open spaces of their unshakable goodness. You are not a stone in the riverbed. You are the river. You are a new model. You are imagining the way forward. Our soul is clapping its hands. Much love to all of you. I know I'll see you next year, but it'll be great to do it in person. God bless you all.